Hey guys, it's Mr. White here with some economics notes for you all about demand, which is of course one part of supply and demand, which is one of the most important things we're going to learn in economics. So get out your notes, follow along, and here we go. Now, to get our brain juices flowing, I thought we'd start off with a little scenario, and this might seem kind of familiar. Maybe you've seen this unfold before in one of your classes. Uh, Imagine that you're selling candy bars in class, right? Or maybe it's not you, maybe it's some other kid in class is selling candy bars, and immediately three classmates are interested. The first classmate says she really wants a candy bar, but she doesn't have any money right now. Now she'll have some money tomorrow. The second classmate says he has the money, but he wants to have the candy bar, but not till after fourth period athletics. The third classmate has the money, wants a candy bar, and is ready and willing to buy one right now. Now ask yourself, which of these three classmates is most appealing from the seller's perspective, the person who's selling the candy bars? And I don't mean who looks the best. I mean, if you're interested in making money off selling candy bars, who are you going to attend to first? The answer to this question is pretty obvious. It's classmate number three that's getting that candy bar. And the reason why has to do with the definition of this thing we call demand. Demand is the combination of the desire, willingness, and ability to purchase a good or a service right now. And you'll notice the key word here is not just desire and willingness, but it's the ability, okay? Those who are not ready, willing, and able to purchase an item right now don't actually contribute to the demand for that item, okay? Now, the reason why the third classmate is the most appealing is because he's the only person who's actually contributing to the demand based on his characteristics. Now, if we think back, classmate number one, she was ready and willing to buy a candy bar, but she's not able to buy it right now because she doesn't actually have a dollar. Classmate number two is able to buy it, but he's not willing to buy it right now. He's going to wait till later. Classmate number three, on the other hand, is ready, willing, and able to buy a candy bar right now. And so that's why if you're the one selling candy bars and you've only got a limited amount of time before first period begins, you're going to use your time to deal with customer number three because he's the one who actually contributes to demand for candy bars. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, so supply and demand, I know it's this big thing, but why is it so important? The reason why is because we live in a market economy, guys. And in a market economy, demand and supply determine the price and availability of goods and services. So this has to do with the free interaction of supply and demand. And the free interaction of supply and demand usually results in economic efficiency. This is all based on something that economists call voluntary exchange. This is a key term here, voluntary exchange. Voluntary exchange just means that nobody tells you what to buy, nobody tells you how to spend your money, nobody tells you what to produce or where to work. Within reason, of course, there's laws that tell you what you can't produce, but basically in our market economy, we all get to make our own decisions. And when we follow our own interests, resources are used more efficiently, and that improves society's welfare. Now, society's welfare doesn't mean like food stamps. We're going to talk about this later. It just means that everybody benefits, okay? Now, one note of caution before we get too deep into all this supply and demand and some of the theory behind it. Supply and demand models are not perfect representations of the real world, okay? As a matter of fact, one of my favorite sayings in economics is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. That was this guy named George Box who said that. He was actually a statistician. But what he means by that is that we try to use these models to try to represent sort of some basic assumptions we have about the way people behave and the way that they make decisions about using their scarce resources. 9 times out of 10, our assumptions are going to be correct, but every once in a while, they're going to be wrong. And so I want you to understand that these models are just a tool to help us understand what's happening in the market. These models aren't always going to be correct, but they're just a good starting point for us to have a conversation and to think about what's happening in the market economy around us. Now, we're going to start off by talking about something called the law of demand. And it's important to recognize that the law of demand is not like the law of gravity, okay? But it's something that we know is mostly true. And the law of demand just says that a change in the price of a good or a service will cause a change in the quantity demanded of that good or a service. Now, pay attention here. We're talking about a change in the quantity demanded. Later on, we're going to talk about a change of demand. That's something different. Now, one thing you're going to notice here as I lay out the law of demand is that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. That means that when the price is high, customers buy less, and when the price is low, they buy more. So the law of demand tells us that when the price of a good or a service rises, the quantity that consumers buy goes down. If the price of a good or a service goes down, then the quantity that consumers buy will go up. So just think of this as consumers like low prices better than high prices. Essentially, when things are cheaper, we buy more. When things are more expensive, we buy less. That's the law of demand. Pretty simple, right? Now, there are two main reasons why the law of demand holds true in almost all situations. And the first one is what's known as the substitution effect. The substitution effect refers to what happens when the price of a good or a service rises, and there are similar or identical products that consumers buy instead. So let's say, for example, if you've only got a limited amount of cash and you want to go buy some cereal, and there's Fruity Pebbles cereal, the name brand stuff, it's real good, and maybe you're used to it costing $2.99, but all of a sudden Kroger decides to raise the price to $3.79. Well, that's going to affect your decision making because you have limited resources, right? You have a limited amount of cash. As a matter of fact, you can see your limited pile of cash right down here. Okay, so instead of buying Fruity Pebbles, could you buy something else? Sure, you could. You could buy some Fruity Dino Bites, right? The knockoff brand, as they say. And that just shows that basically when the price goes up, you're just not going to buy as many Fruity Pebbles. You're going to buy something else instead. It doesn't mean you're not going to have cereal. You're just going to get something different. Now, the second reason why the law of demand makes sense is because of something called the income effect. The income effect means that when the price of a good or a service changes, it can make people feel more or less rich, which in turn affects how much they're going to consume. So in other words, when the price of Fruity Pebbles goes up, well, all of a sudden, this pile of money right here, which might have looked pretty good before, well, it doesn't look so good anymore. You don't feel as rich when all of a sudden now something that used to cost $2.99 costs $3.79. You're having to give up more of your scarce resources just to get that thing that you were always getting before. Now, at the same time, if the price of Fruity Pebbles went down, you might feel more rich because all of a sudden you've basically got an increase of income. You have more money in your pocket even though you bought your Fruity Pebbles because the price of Fruity Pebbles is lower. And so that explains why when the price goes up, people buy less, and when the price goes down, people buy more because of the substitution effect and the income effect. Now, one way we're going to look at demand a lot in this class is on something called a demand schedule. A demand schedule is just a table that lists the quantity demanded at each price, and it can be created for individual consumers or it can be created for the entire market. Most of the time, we're going to look at the entire market, and the sum of all consumers' demand in a market is what we call the market demand schedule. So here's what one of those looks like. Let's say if we were trying to list out the market demand for candy in your first period class. If we had each classmate that's willing and able to buy candy, in other words, each classmate that can contribute to the demand for candy, maybe their demand would look something like this. You can see classmate number 1 right here. It seems like he or she really likes candy because if those candy bars are 25 cents, they're going to buy 8. If the candy bars are 50 cents, they're going to buy 6. If the candy bars are 75 cents, they're going to buy 4. At $1, they would buy 2 candy bars, and at $1.25, they would still buy 1 candy bar. That's a pretty expensive candy bar. So they're buying it at pretty much any price. Classmate number 2 has different numbers. You can see they would buy 6 if they were 25 cents, 4 if they were 50 cents, and so on. And you can look all the way down the line. Classmate number 3, maybe they don't like candy bars as much, or maybe they just don't have as much money. Classmate number 4 and classmate number 5. Basically what we're doing here is we're just adding up all the different demand to get the market demand. So 8 plus, let me change my color here, 8 plus 6 plus 2 plus 5 plus 4 equals 25. Okay, just in case you're wondering where did these market demand numbers come from. And so if you go all the way down the list, we can just kind of trace those out. And that is our market demand. And in this class, we're going to focus, like I said, mostly on market demand for products. Now, once we know our market demand, we can take the next step, which is my favorite part, and we can graph it. When we graph it, we get something called the demand curve. Okay, so here's our market demand curve. Whenever we draw any of these supply and demand curves, one important fact that you got to remember is that we're always going to have an X and a Y axis. The Y axis is always going to show us the price. The X-axis is always going to show us the quantity. Every single time, guys. I say mind your P's and Q's. That means make sure you always put your price on the Y-axis and quantity on the X-axis. Now, most of the time, I'm not going to give you numbers to work with. I just want you to draw out the graph to show me that you understand how the graph works. So throughout this whole process, don't get like freaked out by all these numbers. Most of the time, you don't have to deal with them. It's just about getting the concepts and the key intuition behind these models. Okay, so if we went ahead and plotted out those numbers as we saw on that demand table, the market demand table, it would look something like this. Each number has a price coordinate and a quantity coordinate. So at 25 cents, let me just make this in a color we can really see. At 25 cents, if we just kind of dot over here, you can see we buy 25. At 50 cents, the market demand was 16. At 75 cents, the market demand was 8. At $1, the market demand was like 3, I think, and at 25 cents, it was like 1 or 2. Okay, once you have those points plotted out, we can just play connect the dots, and we can create ourselves a demand curve. Okay, looks something like this. Now, you'll notice that the demand curve slopes downwards. It has a negative slope, and that's because of the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. It's caused by that law of demand that we just talked about. And if you're a math person, you probably know that a linear function is y equals mx plus b. These demand curves are just linear functions. I know that mine doesn't look super linear right now, but the ones we deal with in this class for the most part are going to be straight lines. And later on, we'll get into some more advanced ideas about how we can derive these demand curves. All right, now the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is what happens if the price changes. The demand curve makes some big ceteris paribus assumptions, and the biggest assumption that the demand curve makes is that price is the only thing that affects quantity demanded by consumers. The reason why we know this is because those are the only two labels on our graph. You can see that right down here at the bottom we've got quantity, and up at the top we've got price. So we're basically just saying that the demand for a product only depends on the price. Okay, now that's a ceteris paribus assumption. You may remember that ceteris paribus means all other things remain equal. So we're just assuming that if nothing else in the world changes, consumers only care about the price of a product. And the demand curve is always going to slope downward. And an easy way to remember that is just to say demand down to the sand. I say that to myself all the time when I'm drawing these graphs, okay? Now, since price is the only thing that affects quantity, that means if price changes, we're just going to change the quantity. And what that's going to look like is movement along the curve. So if price changes, we move from one point to another along the demand curve. We just call this movement along the demand curve. So let's say if the price was 50 cents, we're going to have 16 people demanding a candy bar. If the price were to go up to $1, what's going to happen? Are there going to be as many people asking for a candy bar if all of a sudden they cost $1? Well, no. We're going to see the quantity demanded decrease. It's going to go down to 3. And so what we can see here through these little arrows is that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. That's a really important thing I want you to remember. Now, what do you think would happen if the opposite were true? What if it started off as $1 and then all of a sudden the candy bars went to 50 cents? What would happen to the number of people that would want to buy a candy bar? It would increase. And so we would just be moving in the opposite direction, sort of in a southeastern direction along the demand curve. Whereas if the price goes up, we go in a northwestern direction. All right, guys, that's it for video number 1. Make sure you watch video number 2 about demand.